The light is long and low this evening, and it falls across a country you have not visited yet. It falls on the Seine winding through a plain of grain fields, on the chalk ridges of champagne white in the late afternoon, on the oak woods of Burgundy going amber at the edge. It falls on the smoke rising from 100 villages, each one a thin grey thread unravelling into the pale sky. Somewhere to the south, cathedral stone catches the last gold of the sun and holds it a moment before letting it go. Bells carry across the plain. Not one bell, but many, from different towers, overlapping, softening into each other at this distance until the sound is less a sound than a sensation, something in the chest rather than the ear. Tonight, let yourself drift back through 1,000 years of that country's life. You will pass through the last warmth of Roman Gaul, where mosaic floors still gleamed beneath the thatched overhangs of a world in slow transition. You will settle into the sunken huts and timber halls of the early Franks, where the fire was everything and the earth itself was the floor and the roof came down to meet it. You will stand in the field of a man named Bodo, near Paris, in the year 820, and know what it cost him to live. You will hear the alarm bells of the Viking years, the river smoke, the relics packed onto carts and moved inland. You will walk through the age of the cathedrals, when Paris doubled in size, and the stone of Notre-Dame rose from the riverbank on the labour of thousands of unnamed hands. You will sit in the great Burgundian monasteries, where the splendour of one house and the deliberate austerity of another shaped the whole spiritual life of the West. You will move through the wine-growing village in its long, slow peace, and then through the breaking of that peace, the plague summer of Givry, the smoke of the chevauchée, the wolves in the streets of a winter Paris. You will stand in a small village in Lorraine and understand, from the ground up, the world that made a girl named Joan possible. All of it at ground level. All of it quiet. History, when it reaches the people who actually lived it, is mostly texture, the weight of a plough in chalky soil, the smell of a vine row at harvest, the sound of a great cathedral bell when you are standing directly beneath it, and it is the loudest thing the world has ever offered you. Let that be enough tonight. Let it carry you gently toward rest. The light is going now over the Seine plain. Step inside before the cold comes in. The room you step into has a mosaic floor. Not a grand one, not the kind you would find in a wealthy townhouse in Lyon or Nimes, but a real one, a vine tendril, a geometric border, a fish in the centre that someone spent careful weeks pressing into the wet mortar, tessera by tessera. The plaster on the walls is still mostly smooth, still faintly painted in an ochre that has not entirely faded. This was the great room of a villa rustica, a working estate house on the Seine plain, and someone took care with it once. That someone is gone now. Or not quite gone. The estate is still occupied, still producing grain and some wine for a shrinking market. But the family that built the mosaic floor has thinned out. The man who lives here now is a tenant, or something close to it, a colonus, one of the people who work the land and pay their dues upward through a chain of obligation that once stretched, in theory, all the way to Ravenna. That chain is fraying. You can feel the fraying not as drama but as a steady, quiet lessening. You are sitting near a low hearth in the great room, which is no longer the great room. It has become the kitchen, the sleeping place, the centre of daily life, because it is the easiest room to keep warm, and the family has contracted inward toward the heat. The mosaic is partly covered by a spread of straw. The fish is still there, under the straw, perfectly intact, but no one has looked at it in some time. Outside the door, the estate's fields run out in long strips toward the tree line. The grain is in. It is October, and the autumn sowing is done. The seed settled into the turned chalk loam along the northern slope. The stubble of the harvest has been grazed down by the household's 2 sheep and the neighbour's goat, which came through the hedge 3 days ago and has not been returned. A low stone wall along the southern edge of the yard is Roman work, tight-fitted without mortar, still perfectly sound, the kind of construction that requires no maintenance because it was done correctly in the first place. Beyond it, the outbuildings, a thatched timber byre that is partly new timber and partly very old, the original Roman carpentry identifiable by the straightness of the cuts. The Romans built things to last. Things they built are lasting. The people who built them are not here to see it. The year is somewhere around 450, and the world you were born into is not ending with any particular drama. It is simply growing quieter. The tax collector who used to come has not come for 2 years now. The road at the edge of the estate, paved, Roman engineered, arrow straight, is still usable, still a good road, but there is less traffic on it. The merchants who used to pass through with goods from other provinces come less often. A bolt of good dyed cloth, the kind that used to arrive from a workshop in the south, has not been available at the nearest market for 3 seasons. The tiles on the outbuilding were made in a workshop 40 miles away and carried here by a distribution network that required money, organisation, and reliable demand. And all 3 of those things are not quite what they were. You do not have a word for the age you are living through. You are just living through it. The iron is the thing you feel most. There is very little of it left, and very little coming in. Your ploughshare is the most valuable object in the household, more valuable by far than the cooking pot or the best piece of linen, because without it the fields cannot be properly turned, and without the fields there is nothing. When a piece of iron breaks, it is a family crisis. You take the broken blade to the smith in the nearest settlement, but the smith himself has trouble getting good iron, and what he makes is rougher than it used to be. You have seen people pray at a saint's roadside shrine for the return of a lost iron tool, because the saint was faster and cheaper than trying to replace it through trade. The faith that arrived in this landscape 2 or 3 generations ago has already settled into the shape of a community's deepest worries. A broken ploughshare carries with it the same weight of anxiety that a broken leg once did, because the consequences are comparably serious and the remedies almost as uncertain. The kitchen garden behind the main house is still carefully kept. A row of cabbages, some leeks going leggy in the autumn cold, a clump of fennel gone to seed at the corner, a few remaining onions the harvest missed. The garden is the household's most reliable food source and the one least dependent on what the wider world can supply. You know every plant in it by name and by what it does. The sage for the chest cold that comes in February, the rue that keeps the flies off the meat, the watercress in the shallow ditch that runs along the north side. This knowledge is as old as the estate and older. It does not require Rome. Scholars still debate the pace of Roman collapse in northern Gaul, whether it happened over decades or over a century, whether the towns emptied sharply or simply contracted generation by generation. The archaeology is uneven, and the written sources thin out precisely when you most want them. What seems clear is that in the countryside, in the working estates and their tenant families, the change was less a collapse than a slow adjustment, a reorientation toward what was immediately at hand. The estate still produces. The fields still yield. The cow still needs milking at the same hour every morning, regardless of what empire claims to be in charge. 3 languages exist in your world. Your landlord, when he comes, when there is one, speaks a Latin that is elegant and formal, the administrative language of a world in retreat. You yourself speak a rougher vulgar Latin, mixed with older patterns that your grandparents carried and that the educated class has always called merely the way peasants talk. Along the northern rivers, increasingly, there are people who speak a Germanic tongue, Frankish, and whose presence in the landscape is part of the quiet rearrangement of things. At the market, if you go to the market, you can sometimes hear all 3 in the same transaction, each speaker approximating toward the others, getting enough across to buy and sell. It works. Languages find a way when there is work to be done. The child who grows up at the market cross in a settlement like this one will speak something that is already none of these 3 things cleanly. And from that mixture, over the following centuries, a language will coalesce that nobody here can yet imagine or name. The road milestone still stands at the edge of the estate's lower field. Someone carved the emperor's name into it and the mileage to the nearest town. The emperor's name is now almost illegible. The stone has weathered and no one has recut it. But the distance to the town is still accurate because the road is still there. You use the road. You just do not repair it. Nobody repairs it anymore, and no one has organized a repair party in years. The road is wearing down one winter at a time, the paving stones shifting and heaving in the frost, the drainage ditches silting up. In one bad section near the marsh, the road has subsided entirely, and people now go around through the field, leaving a worn earth track beside the old paving. Both tracks exist simultaneously, the Roman road fading and the new track forming, and at some point in the future only the track will remain, and the road will be forgotten under the turf. The estate house itself has a practical continuity that outlasts its formal owners. The stone walls are still sound. Roman construction is stubborn. The foundations will outlast everything built on them by centuries. When a new family eventually makes its home here, as families will, they will build their own structure on the old Roman footings without thinking much about it. The church that comes later will occupy the site of the old shrine at the edge of the yard, the place where the household gods once stood and where women still leave small offerings in certain seasons, because the instinct to ask something larger than yourself for help is not dependent on a specific theology. The new faith has its own language for this instinct. The old instinct underneath it is the same. The pot on the hearth holds beans and dried herb and a piece of salted pork smaller than your fist. The smell of it fills the room, savoury and warm, a good smell, the kind that turns a cold evening inward and makes the dark outside feel separate from this lit interior. You eat this kind of meal most evenings, with bread from the small loaves baked in the estate oven twice a week, and rough wine from the estate's southern slope when the vintage is adequate, and water from the well when it is not. This is not deprivation by the standards of this world. This is a life. It is smaller than the life the mosaic floor was made for, and that smallness is what the whole century feels like from the inside. Not catastrophe, but a quiet contraction, the world drawing in toward what is immediate and manageable and warm. You have children who will grow up in a world that does not call itself Roman at all. They will speak a language that is already not quite Latin and not quite anything else yet. Their children will speak something that will one day be called French, though it will take centuries more to settle into a recognizable form. Right now it is still becoming, the way the whole landscape is still becoming. The field boundaries shifting, the old villa walls slowly going back to stone, a new timber hall going up 200 yards from the old mosaic floor, and the mosaic floor eventually covered over and forgotten, perfectly preserved under the accumulated soil of 1,000 years of someone else's life. The hearth in the great room is small, but it is yours, and the beans in the pot will be enough for tonight. And the straw on the mosaic is clean this autumn, changed in September, and the children are already asleep on their pallets by the wall. You sit beside the low fire, and the tallow dip makes a soft yellow circle on the old ochre plaster, and outside the road is quiet, and the world is smaller than it was, and you are warm enough, and the night is quiet. That has not changed. 2 or 3 generations have passed. The mosaic is gone, or at least invisible, covered by a thick mat of compacted earth and organic material that has built up season by season over the abandoned villa floor. A new structure stands 100 yards from the old walls, lower, darker, its roof of thatch coming down almost to the ground on the long sides, the ridgepole barely head height above you when you stand inside. You live here now. This is the Fonds de Cabane, the sunken hut, and it is what most people in northern Francia live in by the 6th century. Someone dug a rectangle into the earth, perhaps half a metre down, and framed it with timber posts at the corners and bent the roof poles down to meet the walls. The thatch is thick and heavy and in good repair, because a failing roof is a disaster in any century. Inside, the floor is the excavated earth itself, packed and swept, and the fire is a low pit in the centre, and the smoke finds its way out through the same opening that lets in whatever light there is. There is no window. There is the door, and the smoke hole, and the cracks between the thatch stems, and that is all. At night, when the fire is built up, the interior is warm and smoky and dark beyond the fire's reach. It sounds worse than it is. The sunk floor means the earth itself insulates you. The walls hold the warmth the way a root cellar holds the cold, and in a hard January this matters more than almost anything. The animals in the byre end of the building, 2 pigs, some chickens, the family's 1 ox, add their own heat to the air. You have slept in colder places. You do not think of this as poverty. It is what houses are. The smell of the sunken hut is its own world. Wood smoke always, and beneath it the smell of the animals, the warm, yeasty smell of the grain stored in the sealed clay jars along the back wall, the faint animal fat smell of the rush dips burning in their clay holders when you work in the evening. There is a smell of herbs hanging from the ridgepole, dried sage tied in a bundle, some yarrow, a twist of dried apple mint from the corner of the yard, and below everything, the particular smell of packed earth that is the smell of the floor itself, clean but earthen, the scent of the ground you have dug into and made your own. You do not notice it after a while, the way you stop noticing the weight of the air you breathe. The iron is still scarce. It has been scarce all your life and all your father's life, and probably all his father's before that. The ploughshare is iron-tipped, and the axe. One good iron axe, kept sharp, oiled, hung on a specific peg inside the door where it will not be borrowed, is the household's second most precious object after the ox itself. A good iron axe is mentioned in wills. It is given to the eldest son, specifically, by name, in whatever passes for a written record. A wooden plough, wooden pitchforks, wooden shovels, these are the default. You work with wood because wood is what there is, and you save iron for the things wood cannot do. The boy who will inherit the axe knows already which peg it hangs on and does not touch it without being asked. The ox requires particular attention. You water it at the stream every morning, regardless of weather. You feed it the best of what the hay store holds, because the ox is the difference between ploughing and not ploughing, between turning the heavy clay loam in the north field and leaving it for another season. The ox's health is discussed at the settlement's informal gatherings with the same seriousness as a sick child's. More seriousness, if you are honest, because an ox's death is a crisis that can be measured in grain. The winter that the ox died in a settlement 3 miles to the east is still remembered as a marker of time. It was the year before the oak blew down, the year after the frost came in May. The ox is the calendar of catastrophe. In the nearby settlement, on a slight rise above the marshy ground, is the hall. It is not like the villa's great room. Nothing in this world is built in stone for ordinary use. Not yet, not here. But it is larger than any other building in the settlement. Its timbers heavier, its ridgepole higher, its walls more substantial. Inside it is long and dim, benches running along both walls, a fire trench down the centre, the smoke rising to the rafters and finding its way out through the spaces under the eaves. The lord of this place, chieftain, perhaps, or simply the man whose family has held this land longest, and whose kin are the most numerous, and whose gifts at the feast table are the most reliably generous, sits at the far end when there is a feast. And there are feasts. Feasting is how this world does its politics. Loyalty is secured at the table, over mead and roasted pork and the distribution of gifts. Arm rings, cloaks, a knife with a carved bone handle. And the calculation of who sits nearest the fire and who is offered which cup first is a calculation that everyone in the hall makes simultaneously and continuously, because the seating arrangement is the social order made visible. Generosity is not a virtue in this world. It is a duty, and a failure of generosity is a political crisis. The lord who stops giving loses men. The hall is the throne room and the counting house and the dormitory all at once, and in the morning the benches where last night's feasting companions slept are cleared to make room for the next day's business, which is mostly the business of not losing the loyalty you purchased last night. The rushes on the floor of the hall are changed after the great feasts, the old ones swept out with the bones and the spilled mead, and for a day or two the hall smells of fresh-cut reed before the smoke, and the bodies make it into something more familiar. In the year 496, or perhaps 506, the scholars do not quite agree, and the sources are what Gregory of Tours made of them a century later. The king of the Franks named Clovis was baptized a Christian. His wife Clotilde had been working on him for years. The conversion was partly faith, probably, and partly politics, certainly. The bishops of Gaul were the most educated and well-connected men in the landscape. They held the old Roman administrative networks. They had the ear of the peasantry in a way that a Frankish chieftain could not match, and their god was the god of most of the people the Franks were now ruling. For Clovis, aligning with the church was not a mystical event. It was good management. For you, in your sunken hut on the edge of the settlement, the conversion means something more immediate. New holy days added to the year, which means new days when work stops. A new authority standing alongside the Lord's authority, the bishop, the priest, the requirement of dues to the church as well as dues to the estate. The tithe is not yet formally systematized, but the habit of giving a portion of the harvest to the church is already forming. A new calendar, a new set of obligations, a new reason to gather at the settlement's edge where a rough timber chapel is going up on the site of an older ritual space. The faith layers itself over what was already there, absorbs some of it, pushes some of it aside, leaves some of it intact beneath the surface for another 5 centuries. What changes in your day is concrete. You rest on Sunday now, officially, and the priest counts attendance, and the Lord counts the days you rest as days he does not have to pay you not to work. The Salic law, the Lex Salica, codified under Clovis around the year 500, gives us one window into that daily texture. It is a law of prices. Every injury, every theft, every killing has its fine. The life of a Frank is worth more than the life of a Gallo-Roman tenant. The life of a woman of childbearing age is worth 3 times the life of an old man. The law is written in Latin because that is the language of writing, but it describes a world that thinks in Frankish, a world of wordgild, of blood price, of obligations that move through the body and the kin group rather than through the abstract state. It tells you, between its lines, what people worried about losing. It tells you what was precious enough to be worth pricing. The Frankish queens who move through this world are not entirely in the background. Royal women controlled household treasure, the gold, the silver, the jewelled fittings, the physical box of valuables, as their own property by custom and by the weight of royal practice. Clotilde's influence on Clovis's baptism was real, acknowledged in the chronicles, remembered for centuries. Queens like Fredegund, who comes later, wielded power through the royal household itself, controlling access, managing information, holding the treasury when the king was away or ill. The treasure chest is not a metaphor. It is a locked wooden chest, sometimes iron-banded, and the queen who holds the key to it holds something real. Gregory of Tours is watching all of this from his bishop's seat, writing it down in his Historia Francorum with the vivid, gossipy enthusiasm of a man who is convinced he is living through times of great significance. He probably is. But Gregory writes for the church and the court, and his world is the world of bishops and kings, and his attention to the daily life of the people in the sunken huts is intermittent at best. He notices miracles. He notices murders at the royal court. He notices the theological disputes of the great. The man in the Fonds de Cabane, counting his iron axe among his most valued possessions, appears in Gregory only as a background figure. The peasantry, the people who feed everyone else and leave almost no record of their own thoughts. That is the honest condition of this history. We see the structure, we glimpse the texture, we infer the life. Outside the sunken hut, the evening is settling in. The smoke from the hall carries the smell of roasting meat, which is a feast smell and not an everyday smell. Your own fire is low tonight, the pot of rough-grained porridge keeping warm on the edge of the hearth. The children are quiet. Your neighbour 2 plots over is singing something to her baby, a slow rhythmic thing that has no particular origin and will never be written down and will be forgotten when she is gone. The night outside is very dark and very large, and the hall fire is warm, and the gods, the old ones and the new one, are all present in the same field, and you hold them all lightly, without much contradiction, the way a person does when they are tired and it is getting late, and the world is larger than any theology has so far been able to account for. The year is 820, and you have a name. That is more than most people in this history can claim. Your name is Bodo, and you farm a manse, a holding of roughly 12 hectares, belonging to the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, just outside Paris. Your wife's name is Ermentrude. You are documented in the Polyptych of Abbot Ermenon, a survey of the monastery's estates completed around this time, and you are among the only Carolingian peasants for whom we have names, a location, and a precise accounting of what they owed and what they held. The Polyptych measured you to the nearest perch. It recorded how many hectares you farmed, how many children you had, what labour you owed the monastery, what payments in grain and wine and chickens you owed on top of that. It is not a document that was made with your comfort in mind. It was made so that the monastery's accountants could know exactly what they were owed, and from whom, and by when. But because of that document, you exist. Without it, you would be as nameless as your grandfather. You owe 3 days a week on the monastic demesne, the monastery's home farm, worked by tenants like you under the steward's direction. On those days, you plough the monastery's strips, not your own. You sow the monastery's seed. You cut the monastery's grain when the harvest comes. The remaining 4 days are theoretically yours, for your own land, your own crops, your own animals. In practice, the line between your days and their days is never quite as clean as the Polyptych makes it sound. Ploughing cannot always wait for the calendar. Harvest cannot wait for the calendar. When the weather turns and the grain is ready, the question of whose day it technically is ceases to matter beside the simple urgency of the grain that must come in before the rain does. The demesne ploughing is heavy work in this soil. The chalk loam north of Paris is workable but cold, slow to warm in spring and the first turning of the year. In late February or early March, when the ground is wet and the air is still grey with cold, is the hardest day of the farming year. The ox leans into the harness, and the ploughshare lifts the long curling ribbon of dark soil and turns it over, and the walking behind the plough is a slow back and forth across the length of the strip, hour after hour, the feet in the furrow, the hands on the handles, the body doing a thing it does well from pure repetition. You are very good at this. You have been doing it since you were old enough to be useful at the handles, learning from your father the small adjustments of grip and angle that keep the furrow true. The plough is not yours. It belongs to the monastery, like the ox, like the land. But the skill is yours, and nobody can take the skill away. Ermentrude does not appear in the polyptych as a worker in the fields. She appears as Bodo's wife, with a number of children. But the polyptych also records that the monastery's estate has a weaving workshop, and that the women attached to the estate, the wives and daughters of the tenant families, work there at spinning and dyeing and weaving. Ermentrude spins. She dyes. She sews. The cloth produced in that workshop is not luxury cloth. It is working cloth, rough and durable, and it goes to clothe the monastery's servants and lay workers and to supply whatever the estate needs. The work is not called labour in the polyptych the way the ploughing is called labour, because the polyptych is not a document of women's work. But the work is real and it is constant, and Ermentrude's hands know it. Her hands know the particular resistance of the wool on the distaff, and the rhythm of the spindle's weight pulling the thread out to an even gauge, and the smell of the vat of welled dye in yellow or wode in blue that hangs in the weaving house on the days when dyeing is done. A sharp vegetable smell that gets into the cloth and into the skin and takes days to fade. The manse is the unit of everything in this world. It is not just a piece of land. It is a legal status, a bundle of obligations, a position in the social architecture of the estate. A full manse holder is not the same as a half manse holder, who is not the same as a cottager with a garden and a claim on the demesne that barely amounts to an obligation at all. The manse defines what you owe, what court you answer to, what military levy might fall on your family in a bad year when the Carolingian army needs feeding. You are not a free tenant in the way the classical Roman law understood freedom. But you are not a slave either. You occupy one of the many gradations in between that medieval documents name variously as servus, colonus, litus, depending on which estate surveyor is writing the charter and which tradition he is drawing from. The gradations are real even when the names vary. The monastery itself is a few miles away, and its barn is enormous. The barn is, in a very real sense, the church's bank. The tithe, 1/10 of the produce of every holding, has been formally required of the whole Frankish church since Charlemagne codified it in the last generation. Every harvest, 1/10 of your grain, your hay, your wine, your chickens, your eggs goes to the church. It goes into that barn, along with the tithes of every other holding in the monastery's orbit. The barn stores the surplus. The surplus feeds the monks, the monastery's servants, the guests the rule requires the monks to receive, the poor who come to the gate on feast days. The barn is the treasury, the insurance fund, and the instrument of the church's local power, all in one enormous thatched structure. You have stood at the gate on a feast day and seen the bread distributed. coarse loaves, the kind made from the lower grades of the monastery's grain, and understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that the bread distributed at the gate is made from what was taken from your field. The monastery's garden is a different world from your own kitchen plot. The Capitulaire de Villis, the Emperor Charlemagne's instruction to his estate managers, issued around 812, lists 73 plants that must be grown in every imperial garden. Sage, rue, rosemary, fennel, watercress, garlic, onions, leeks, the whole practical repertoire of a kitchen garden and a herb physic combined. The instruction tells the estate managers to keep the tools in good repair, to maintain the correct number of cattle, to ensure the orchards are properly managed. Whether the monastery down the road follows imperial instructions or its own traditions, the result is that the monastic garden is larger than yours, more systematically planted, and tended by people who have the time to do it properly, because the garden is part of their rule rather than an addition to a long day of field work. Your own garden has the cabbages and the leeks and the onions and the sage in its corner, because those are the things you know how to grow and the things that keep people alive through February. Charlemagne is dead by the time the Polyptych is written. He died in 814, 7 years after crowning himself, or having the Pope crown him. Emperor of the Romans in a ceremony in Rome that no one had quite planned and that caused immediate diplomatic embarrassment with Constantinople. His son Louis the Pious rules now. None of this is your immediate concern. Your immediate concern is the state of the Southfield's drainage ditch, which has been holding water since the spring floods and will rot the roots if it is not cleared before the autumn sowing. The manse requires constant maintenance. The ditch, the hedge, the roof of the byre, the fence around the kitchen garden where the cabbages are. Every neglected thing compounds into a larger problem. You do not have the luxury of neglect. 2 fields away, in the Carolingian sense of distance, Alcuin of York is teaching the children of Frankish nobles to read at Ashen, and manuscript copying is happening in a dozen monasteries within a day's ride of where you are standing, and the great chant reform is being worked out in the liturgical practice of the church, and coins are being minted to a new standard and royal inspectors. The Missi Dominici, the Sent Lords, 1 bishop and 1 count together, are riding through the estates, checking the accounts and hearing complaints against abusive stewards. All of this is happening. You know about perhaps 1/10 of it. The manuscript copying happens in a scriptorium you have never entered. The chant reform changes what you hear on Sundays. The Missi Dominici occasionally represent a channel of complaint, a way to report that the steward has been taking more than the Polyptych says you owe, a way to put a grievance in front of someone who will at least write it down. Whether it changes anything depends on the particular missi and the particular steward and the particular year. The distance between your world and the Carolingian Renaissance is not a distance of miles. It is a distance of literacy. You cannot read. The Polyptych that names you, that measures your field to the nearest perch, is a document you have never seen and could not have read if you had. The steward read it to you, or read the relevant parts of it. Your obligations, your dues, your labour schedule. And you remembered what he said the way you remember everything important, by repetition and by the consequences of forgetting. The Renaissance is happening in the monasteries and the palace school, and it is real, and it will matter for centuries. What it gives you, Bodo, is the standardized chant you hear on Sundays and the slightly more organized church calendar that tells you when Lent begins. What you give it is the grain in the tithe barn. Picture yourself on a late summer evening, Bodo, standing at the edge of the south field with the drainage work finally done. Your hands are dark with the mud from the ditch. Ermentrude is inside, the spinning going again as it goes every evening, the thread pulling out from the raw wool in the failing light. The monastery bell. You can hear it from here, just a low sound carried by the right wind, is calling the monks to vespers. They will sing the evening office and go to their refectory and eat what the barn provides. You will eat the pottage in the pot and sleep in the manse, and tomorrow is a demesne day. The bell is the same bell for both of you. It marks the same hours. The world you share is exactly this big and exactly this unequal, and it will be recognizable in its structure, if not in its specific people, for the next 4 centuries. The first thing is the smell. Not smoke exactly, something more immediate, more acrid, the smell of something that should not be burning but is. You are standing in a field on the north bank of the Seine, somewhere between Paris and the sea, and the smell is coming from upriver, from the direction of the monastery that you can see on a clear day as a cluster of low rooftops and one stone tower above the willow-lined bank. The monastery is on fire. That is what the smell means. You know it before you see the column of grey-black smoke rising above the willows, because you have been told what to watch for and what it means when you see it. The stories have been circulating for 2 years, 3 years, carried by river traders and travellers, and the thin thread of news that connects one settlement to the next along the water. They come from the north. They come up the rivers. The longships draw almost no water, and they can move faster than anything you have ever seen move, and the monks at the monastery had time to ring the alarm bell. You heard it earlier, not the slow, steady toll of the canonical hours, but the rapid, frantic ringing that means something else. And then the bell stopped. The river is the thing to understand. The Seine runs from the sea to Paris and beyond, and every mile of it is navigable to a shallow-drafted boat. The Loire runs from the Atlantic coast into the heart of the country. The rivers that the Romans used as highways for trade, the same channels that carry the wine barrels and the grain barges in the ordinary years, are the invasion routes now. There is no good defense of a river. You cannot wall it off. You cannot patrol every bank for 200 miles. The fleet that stormed Nantes in 843 did it during the feast of St. John the Baptist, when the bishop was at the altar and the church was full and the city was not expecting anyone to arrive from the direction of the sea. The bishop was killed there at the altar in his vestments. News of that atrocity moved through every ecclesiastical network in the kingdom within months, because bishops are the information infrastructure of this world, and when a bishop is murdered at his altar, the information travels fast. The village on the riverbank is not Nantes. It is smaller and further from the sea, and has so far been spared. But spared is a provisional condition, and everyone knows it. The farmers along this stretch of the river have learned to read the water the way they read the weather, a change in the sound of the current an unusual number of birds startled from the reed beds upstream, a smell on the morning air that does not belong to the season. The village has dug a pit under the floor of the largest byre, lined it with clay, filled it with sealed pots of grain and a small bag of the household's few silver coins, tamped the clay cap down smooth, replaced the straw over it. The pit is a fact of life here now. It was not 10 years ago. Everything that represents a crisis to lose has been thought about in terms of how quickly it can be moved or hidden. In 845, a fleet under a leader the chronicles call Ragnar sailed up the Seine as far as Paris and laid siege to the city. Charles the Bald, the Carolingian king, paid £7,000 of silver to make them leave. £7,000 of silver must be raised from every estate in the kingdom. The grain levy and the coin levy that arrive at your settlement with a royal messenger and an armed escort, polite, official, unavoidable, are the fiscal echo of that distant negotiation. You pay the tribute in grain, and in the few pennies you have managed to accumulate from the sale of a pig and a surplus of eggs at the market. You pay it on top of the tithe, on top of the labour dues, on top of the mill toll. The Danegeld is not charged once. It is charged again every time the ships come back. And the ships come back. The fragmentation of the Carolingian world is both the cause and the consequence of the Viking terror. The great empire that Charlemagne assembled did not survive his grandsons. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided it 3 ways, and the divided kingdoms were each weaker than the whole, and none of them could mount an adequate defence of all the rivers at once. The royal answer, the only answer available, given the scale of the problem, was to devolve defence to local men. A count here, a duke there, given the authority and the obligation to defend their region with their own resources. The Count of Paris becomes more powerful than the Carolingian king. The Duke of Normandy, the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Flanders. These men accumulate power during the Viking century, not despite the crisis, but because of it. The great feudal principalities of France are born from the inadequacy of the old order. The raid season has a rhythm that the river villages come to know the way they know the farming seasons. Spring and early summer bring the ships before the harvest, when the monasteries are most accessible and the rivers are running high. The autumn is the second dangerous season, when the new harvest is in and the grain stores are full, and a successful raid means provisions that will last a Norse winter. Between raids, between the years when the ships do come and the years when they do not, there is the ordinary life of the village, the ploughing, the sowing, the weeding, the harvest, the animals, the children, the same sequence it has always been. The fear does not replace the life. It sits alongside it, the way cold sits alongside warmth in a stone building. Always there, always at the edge, never entirely absent even in the warmest rooms. An old woman in the settlement remembers the year the ship came as far as the mill on the bend, and the miller ran and the mill burned, and the miller came back 3 days later and found his millstone intact in the ash. And she tells this story to every child who will listen, because the children need to know, and the millstone is still there, proving the story true. The monasteries respond in the only way they can. The relics, the saints' bones, the gilded reliquaries, the cloth fragments and nail parings and hair samples that are the spiritual collateral of the medieval church, are packed onto carts and moved inland when the alarm goes up. The monks who can travel go with them. The manuscripts go with them, rolled in oilcloth, tied with cord, carried by the youngest and most mobile brothers who have been given the specific duty of not being captured. What cannot be moved is sometimes buried. A chalice wrapped in linen and packed into a clay pot and buried under the chapter house floor. A set of illuminated psalters hidden in a dry section of the crypt behind a section of wall that is mortared over quickly and then left to look like ordinary stone. Some of those things stayed hidden long enough to be found by archaeologists 1,000 years later, still wrapped, still sealed, perfectly preserved. The siege of Paris in 885 and 86 lasted a year. Count Odo held the city with a courage that everyone agreed was exceptional, and the monasteries moved their relics inland on carts, and the monks fled with their manuscripts, and the king eventually bought the Vikings off anyway. A village on the lower Seine in those years was a place of constant managed fear. The fear was not the sharp fear of battle. Most of the raiding missed, most of the villages, most of the time. It was the duller, more exhausting fear of not knowing when or whether, the fear that made farmers dig pits under their floors to hide grain, that made women bury their small stock of silver pennies under the threshold stone, that made whole communities watch the river with a new and anxious attention. Some of those buried hoards were never reclaimed. The person who buried them did not return, for one reason or another, and the coins stayed in the dark under the door for 1,000 years. The outcome, in the long view, was stranger than anyone living through it could have anticipated. In 911, a Norse leader named Rollo, whose fleet had been raiding the Lower Seine for years, received the lands of the Lower Seine as a fief from the Carolingian king Charles the Simple. He became a duke. His followers became Normans, the Northmen who had settled, who had married French women, who had sent their children to be educated in French, who within 2 generations spoke almost no Norse at all. The grandsons of the men who burned monasteries on the Seine were the Norman dukes who would, in 150 years, conquer England. History does not often resolve into irony so cleanly. The village on the river that watched the longships pass and buried its coins under the threshold stone was also, in some dim way, watching the beginning of something that would change a different country entirely. For the village on the riverbank, the new order meant a castle. Not yet stone. Stone would come later. But a timber tower on a mound of earth, built by local labour under the new duke's or count's authority, visible on the horizon as the permanent symbol of a new local power. The mound itself is labour, the earth dug from the ditch around the base and piled upward by men with wooden spades working in autumn mud, their breath making clouds in the cold air, the count's overseer walking the perimeter and checking the height against a measuring pole. You contributed 2 weeks of your labour to that mound. You did not choose to. Safety, sometimes. Dues, always. Labour on the castle walls, regularly. The castle is the trade the village makes, protection purchased at the cost of a new kind of dependency, a new layer of obligation piled on top of the monastic tithes and the Carolingian labour dues that never quite went away. Now, picture yourself that autumn evening, the monastery smoke finally clearing from the river bend air, the bell silent. The monastery's cattle have been driven off. The granary is ash. Some of the monks got away into the woods to the east. Some did not. You know this the way you know most things in this world, imperfectly, through second-hand reports, with the details unreliable and the general shape of the horror clear enough. You check the pit under the floor of the byre where you put the family's reserve of grain in a sealed clay pot last spring. It is still there. The clay cap is undisturbed. You press your hand against it for a moment, feeling the cool ceramic under your palm, and then you go back inside, because there is nothing else useful to do tonight, and the children need to eat, and the fire needs a log, and the darkness outside is very large, and the door is the only thing between you and it. The castle is stone now. Or most of it is. The keep is stone, rebuilt from the timber motton bailey of your grandfather's time, the walls thick enough to stand against fire and most missiles that a medieval army could produce. You can see it from your strip in the lower field, a pale limestone rectangle on the slight rise at the edge of the village, a standard presence in the landscape that you have stopped consciously noticing because it is simply always there, the way the church tower is always there, the way the horizon is always there. The year is somewhere around 1050, and the Kingdom of France is ruled by a king named Henry, who controls a strip of land around Paris that is, in practice, smaller than the holdings of several of his own great lords. Hugh Capet's descendants sit on the throne, elected in 987 to a kingship that was, from the beginning, first among equals in theory and barely that in fact. The Duke of Normandy is more powerful. The Duke of Aquitaine governs a country that feels in practice more like a separate kingdom than a vassal's fief. The Count of Flanders controls the richest wool-producing region in northern Europe. France in 1050 is not really a country in the way you might think of a country. It is a patchwork of competing jurisdictions, a feudal argument made of fields and castles and oaths of homage that are honoured approximately and broken conveniently. None of this changes your morning. You are up before full light. The hearth needs coaxing from last night's banked ash. The ox needs watering. The south strip wants turning before the weather changes. The particular quality of feudalism that reaches your daily life is not the king's weakness or the duke's ambition. It is the ban. The ban is the lord's right to tax the use of his mill, his oven, his wine press. Not a right he exercises occasionally, at festival time, as a kind of ceremonial acknowledgement of his lordship. A right he exercises every week, every loaf, every sack. You must take your grain to the Lord's mill. You must pay in kind. A portion of the milled flour goes back to the miller, who goes back to the Lord. You must bake in the Lord's oven, the great beehive-shaped structure in the courtyard of the manor house, because the Lord's oven is the only legitimate baking oven in the village, and if you build your own, you will be fined and it will be torn down. You must press your grapes. If you have grapes, if you live in a village that has the right conditions for them, in the Lord's wine press, with the same portion extracted at the pressing. The Chateau Banalité is the medieval economy's most intimate daily mechanism. Not an annual event, but a weekly one, woven into every meal, present in every loaf. The mill stands by the stream at the village's lower end, and the miller, a man with a reputation for cleverness that is not meant as a compliment, runs it under the Lord's soak. The soak means you cannot grind elsewhere. There is no elsewhere. The mill is the monopoly, and the monopoly is the mechanism, and the mechanism feeds the Lord's household, and the Lord's horses, and the Lord's obligation to feed his own retinue, and the whole thing is a chain of extraction with you, at the bottom contributing grain, and receiving in return the doubtful benefits of the Lord's justice, the Lord's military protection, and the Lord's occasional inability to remember which of his obligations to you he is currently failing to fulfill. A man named Chaucer will one day write about a miller and call him a thumb of gold, and everyone will understand exactly what he means, because the reputation of the miller is the same in every village in every century. The man with his hand in your grain. You bring a sack of rye to the mill on a Tuesday, because Tuesday is milling day on this manor, and the queue begins at first light. The smell of the mill is stone dust and damp grain, and the particular sour warmth that comes off the millstones when they have been running for hours. The sound of the wheel in the stream is a constant churning undertone beneath the scratch and rumble of the stones themselves. You wait your turn in a yard full of people doing the same thing. The widow from the upper row, the two brothers from the east strip, the monastery's man who brings the largest sacks and goes to the front of the line, because the monastery's grain and the monastery's patience are both inexhaustible. When your sack comes out the other side of the process, it is lighter than it went in, by a proportion you have estimated and accepted and still privately resent. You carry it home on your back. The bread you will bake from it will taste of rye and wood smoke and the particular mineral edge of this valley's water, and it will be the best thing about tomorrow morning. The serfdom that is hardening in this century is not the serfdom of the ancient world. It is something the lawyers are still arguing the edges of, something that varies from one lord's custom to the next, from one region's law to another's. But the practical reality is that the free tenant of Carolingian times, the colonus who held a manse and owed specific fixed obligations, is becoming something else. Main morte, the lord inherits a serf's goods at death before the children do. For marriage, a serf who wants to marry outside the estate pays a fee for permission. The freedom that was theoretically there in the polyptych's categories is being quietly renegotiated, and the renegotiation always goes in the same direction. The manse you hold is 10 hectares, perhaps 12 if the lower meadow counts, and it defines you in law more precisely than your name. Your obligations are written into the manorial survey in the steward's careful hand. 3 days a week of labour on the demesne in the busy seasons, 2 days in the slack ones, plus a certain number of chickens at Martinmas, a certain weight of grain at harvest, a certain day's cartage when the Lord needs goods moved. The obligations are specific enough to feel finite when you read them, and open-ended enough in practice that they expand to fill whatever time you thought you had to spare. The demesne work comes first. The Lord's fields are ploughed before yours. The Lord's hay is cut before yours. The Lord's autumn ploughing is finished before you turn to your own strips. You get home when you get home. The children have been in the field since they were old enough to scare birds. The parish church at the upper end of the village is the building you know best. Not because you are especially devout. Devotion is not quite the word for the relationship you have with the faith, which is more intimate and less optional than devotion implies, but because the church is the clock, the courthouse, the meeting place, and the largest enclosed space in your world. The bell marks the canonical hours for anyone within earshot, which is everyone in the village and several households beyond. The feast of the patron saint is the year's largest gathering, more people than you will see in one place at any other time, more noise, more food, more dancing in the churchyard until the priest comes out and tells you to stop, and then slightly less dancing, slightly further from the church door. The church is rough Romanesque stone, low and thick-walled, with a carved tympanum above the door. Saints' faces worn smooth by a century of rain, and inside a smell of beeswax and damp stone, and the particular cold that never quite leaves a thick stone building even in summer. The priest knows the parish the way a farmer knows soil, by decades of close attention, by having buried the grandparents of the people now sitting in the nave. He keeps the baptism register, which doubles as the village's birth record and the Lord's tax base for children who survive. He dispenses such medical advice as he has, which is often the same advice the herbalist at the edge of the village dispenses, drawing on the same general understanding that certain plants ease certain symptoms, and that prayer helps in cases where the plants do not. He settles small disputes from the steps of the church, which serves as the court of first resort for quarrels over boundary stones and inherited chickens and the proper location of a neighbour's dung heap. He is, in his way, as much a part of the village's infrastructure as the mill and the oven, and equally difficult to replace when he is gone. The Peace of God movement has been trying, for the past generation or so, to make this landscape slightly less violent. Church councils in Burgundy and Aquitaine, beginning around 990, decreed that it was forbidden to make war on peasants, clergy, pilgrims, merchants, and women. Then the Truce of God expanded this to forbid fighting on Sundays, on feast days, during Lent, during Advent. The movement is, in its way, a document of how routine violence against the people at the bottom of this world actually was. You do not forbid things that are not happening. The church thought it worth trying to stop. Whether it stopped, it is a separate question. But the councils met, and the decrees were read from pulpits, and occasionally they were even enforced. The calendar of the church is not merely a spiritual calendar, it is the practical spine of your year. Lent arrives in February and takes the meat off the table until Easter, which is a real hardship in the lean weeks before the spring and a real discipline, and both things at once. Easter brings the first communal release from Lent's strictures, a Sunday dinner that tastes of relief as much as food. Martinmas on the 11th of November is the slaughter day. The animals that cannot be carried through winter on the hay that has been cut and stored are killed in the November cold, and the blood and the fat and the offal are dealt with in a long, efficient, slightly solemn day's work that results in salted pork and dried sausage and enough fat rendered to keep the lamps burning through the short days ahead. Martinmas is also rent day on many manors. The combination of butchering and paying your dues gives November a particular quality, productive and depleting simultaneously. Stand in the lower field at the end of the afternoon and look across the village. The castle on its rise. The church tower at the upper end. The mill by the stream. The smoke from the row of cottage hearths, each one a household, each household a manse, each manse a web of obligations running upward toward the Lord's hall, and the monastery in the distance, and the bishop's city further still, and, theoretically, the king in Paris, though the king is a remote and slightly theoretical figure from here. The strips of the open field run out around you, each household's share interleaved with the next in the old Carolingian pattern, the plough lines of 10 generations visible in the ground under your feet. Somewhere to the south, across 2 ridges and a day's walk, a second church bell is sounding at a different hour. The difference tells you something about the size of the landscape and the independence of its communities. This is France in 1050. Not a country yet, not quite, but a landscape of accumulated obligations. And it is the landscape you were born into and will die in, and within it the day has its shape, and the shape is familiar, and the fire in the cottage will be warm when you get home. It begins before the light is fully up. You can hear it before you see it. The knock of a mallet on a chisel, rhythmic and patient, somewhere above and to the east. Then the creak of a rope, the distant shout of one man to another across an enormous height of air. You are standing on the Cluny and Citeaux in Paris in the year 1180, and the Cathedral of Notre-Dame has been under construction for 17 years and will not be substantially complete for another 70. The quarry at Vaugirard, a place of grey limestone cliffs south of the city, reachable by boat up the Seine, has been supplying stone at a scale that has no precedent in living memory. Flatboats move up and down the river loaded with cut stone, the water lapping close to the gunwales, the bargemen leaning on their poles. On the island, the site is a controlled chaos of stacked stone and scaffolding, and men doing specific work with the focused efficiency of people who have been doing the same task for years. There are no records of most of their names. They are quarrymen, carters, rope makers, smiths, setters, mortar mixers, hod carriers, spit boys turning the meat over the site fires, a whole city of labour around the fact of the building. And above them, the masons, the men who can read stone the way a musician reads notes, who know which block goes where and why the arch must be cut at exactly this angle, or it will not hold the weight above it. The mortar that binds these blocks takes time to cure, and in that curing time the building stands in a particular state of provisional completion. Sections that are sound and tight, sections where the mortar is still young and the stones still settling into their final positions, sections where the scaffolding is the only thing maintaining the geometry. A master mason manages all of this simultaneously across a building that is already larger than any building most of his workers have ever seen, let alone worked on. He holds the design in his head and in his templates, wooden forms that transfer the profiles of arches and mouldings from the plan to the stone. And the design is not a fixed thing, but a living one, adjusted as the building rises and reveals what it wants to become. Gothic engineering is new enough in this decade that the men doing it are working at the edge of what has been done before. Notre-Dame will turn out to be, as archaeologists discovered after the fire of 2019, the first known cathedral to incorporate iron reinforcements within its masonry. Iron clamps and rods locked into the stonework at critical load points, invisible from outside, doing invisible work. The flying buttress, the great arched struts that spring outward from the walls to carry the lateral thrust of the vault, is the technology that makes the walls into glass. Without the buttress taking the sideward push of the stone ceiling, the wall would have to be thick enough to resist it, and thick walls have few windows. The buttress carries the thrust away, and the wall becomes a frame for light. Glass fills it. The building becomes a vessel of coloured light, which is not an accident but a theology, a built argument about the nature of the divine. The glaziers work in a yard at the edge of the site, setting coloured glass into lead frames on a tracing board laid flat on a table. The design for each window comes from a master who understands that the colour must read from 30 feet below in the nave, which means the individual pieces of glass are larger than you might think, and the leading lines are bolder than they look from close up. A deep ruby ground, a figure in white and ochre, the whole framed in a blue that varies by the time of day. Indigo in the morning light, luminous at noon, dimming to something almost black at dusk. The men who cut and lead the glass will not be named in any document either. The windows will be named after the donors who paid for them, the guilds and bishops and royal houses whose coats of arms appear in the lower registers. The craftsmen are in the glass itself, in the quality of the cut and the skill of the leading, which outlasts anything anyone will write about them. The Paris that surrounds this construction site has roughly doubled in population over the last 100 years and is still growing. The university is establishing itself on the left bank, not yet the formal institution it will become, but the cathedral schools gathering students and masters in numbers that are beginning to create a new kind of person. Poor young men from villages all over France and beyond are crammed into the streets and lodging houses of the left bank, copying manuscripts by tallow light, arguing in Latin about Aristotle, eating badly and sleeping worse, and inventing something that has not existed before. The scholar as a social type, the person whose trade is ideas. There is no memory foam in a left bank student's lodgings. There is no central heating, no meal delivery, no reliable income. There is Aristotle and a tallow dip and a cold stone floor and the argument, and for some of them that turns out to be enough. The left bank smells of tallow candles and river mud, and the particular overripe smell of too many young men living too closely together on not enough money. It sounds, in the early evening, like disputation, the formal academic exercise in which a thesis is proposed and attacked and defended in the most elaborate verbal form that medieval Latin can produce. The subject tonight, from a window above the narrow street, is whether matter or form is the more primary principle of a thing's existence, and the two voices going at it are so evenly matched that the disputation will probably run past midnight. Neither of them will sleep much. Both of them will be doing it again tomorrow. The commune movement is reshaping the towns around the same decades. In Léon, in Soissons, in Amiens, the townspeople, artisans, merchants, tradesmen, have bought or fought for charters of self-government. A bourgeois is a new legal category in the world, a person who lives in a burg, a town, and who is neither serf nor knight nor cleric. He owes fixed rents, not labour. He can bring a case in the king's court. He can leave. That last right, the right to leave, is the thing that distinguishes him most clearly from the person in the village outside the town walls, and it is the thing that makes the town an engine of a new kind of social mobility, slow and uneven, and always subject to the Lord's interference, but real. The covered market hall, the Halle, stands at the centre of any prosperous French town of this century, and it is the most honest building the town contains. It has no religious meaning, no political ambition. It is simply a covered space large enough to shelter a market from rain, with open sides so the light comes in and the buyers and sellers can see each other clearly. On market day, the stalls fill from the inside out. The cloth merchants, with their bolts of wool and linen near the centre, the bakers with their loaves on the trestle tables near the entrance, the butchers in a separate row because the blood runs down the channel cut in the paving for exactly this purpose. The smell of the market is baking bread and raw meat and animal in the adjacent square, and threading through everything, the tallow candles from the candlemaker's stall where the wicks are still being dipped one at a time in the vat of rendered fat. You buy what you need, and the transaction is not described anywhere except in the accumulated memory of the market day, which is every Tuesday, as it has been for as long as anyone's grandfather can remember. Further east, in the towns of Champagne, Troyes, Provins, Bar-sur-Aube, Lagny. A different kind of engine is running. The Champagne fairs have been operating since roughly the 11th century and will reach their peak over the next 100 years. 6 great fairs per year, spread through the calendar, each lasting weeks, each transforming the town that hosts it. The Flemish cloth merchants arrive from the north with bolts of fine wool that no French peasant can afford. The Italian merchants arrive from the south with silk, spice, and the financial instruments that the cloth trade requires. The French merchants arrive with wine and grain. The lettre de foire, the fair letter, an early written instrument of commercial credit, allows a transaction to be settled later at the next fair in a different town with a different merchant through a chain of written obligations that do not require the actual silver to physically travel between parties. This is the beginning, in France, of something that will eventually be called banking, and it is happening in a tent in a field in Champagne. The fair transforms the town around it in ways that go beyond commerce. The inns fill past capacity, and people sleep in stable lofts and under market stalls, and in arrangements that the innkeeper would rather not describe to the bishop. The streets are loud at hours when the streets of a medieval town are normally silent. The money changers' tables are set out in a covered arcade, each changer surrounded by small piles of coins from 6 different currencies that must be assessed for weight and purity before anyone will accept them at face value. An Italian merchant from Genoa and a cloth dealer from Bruges negotiate across a language gap they bridge with gestures and numbers, and a shared Latin of commerce that neither of them speaks natively, but both of them find adequate. They will meet again at the next fair, in a different town, and the relationship they have built, the shared knowledge of what the other one is, what he will and will not accept, whether his word is reliable, is worth something that the ledger does not record. The peddler who moves between the fairs and the villages of the surrounding countryside is the information infrastructure of this world as much as the commerce. He carries needles in his pack and news in his conversation, prices and gossip, and the rumour of wars at the far edge of the realm, the name of the new bishop, and the quality of the harvest in a valley 3 days' walk away. The peddler is the village's post office, its news service, its weather report, and its occasional gentle priest. He sets down pins and picks up sorrow in equal measure, and both require careful handling. The cathedral above you is rising. Today the masons are working on a section of the triforium, the gallery above the nave arcade. And from where you stand on the bridge you can see the scaffold extending outward over the water, the men on it moving with the confident deliberateness of people who work at height every day and have stopped finding it frightening. One of them is eating something, perched on a timber ledge 60 feet above the river, looking out over the city with the particular expression of a man who has a good view and is making use of it. The Seine below him carries the usual Monday morning traffic, a grain barge heading upstream, 2 fishermen in a small boat working the shallows below the bridge, a cart on the bank unloading limestone blocks from a flatboat with the unhurried efficiency of men paid by the day. He will not be named in any document. The cathedral will be named after Our Lady. The man eating his bread on the scaffold will not be named in anything. But his hands are in the walls. Burgundy in the early 12th century is a world divided against itself in the most productive possible way. The division is not political. It is theological, aesthetic, and deeply practical, and it plays out between two monastery complexes separated by 30 kilometers of oak forest and the Grosnay River Valley. At Cluny, the great abbey founded in 910, and now at the height of its power, the liturgy lasts for 8 hours of every day. 8 hours. The office is stretched and elaborated far beyond what Benedict's rule originally prescribed. The choral singing extended and refined over 2 centuries into something of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The great church. The Mare Ecclesia, completed in the early 1200s, is the largest building in Christendom. Its columns rise to a height that requires visitors to stop and simply look upward. The gold vessels on the altar catch the light from the high clerestory windows and throw it back amplified. The choir monks. There are perhaps 300 of them here at Cluny's peak. Sing through the night office and the day offices in a sound that fills the building from the floor to the painted vault in a way that is not music in the ordinary sense, but something more like the building itself vibrating. The splendor is the prayer. The beauty is the argument. Visitors leave describing it in terms they normally reserve for the natural world, for mountains and storms, for things that cannot be made by human hands. Cluny was founded by William I of Aquitaine with a charter that placed the abbey directly under the Pope, not the local bishop. This matters more than it sounds. A monastery under the bishop's authority is subject to the bishop's interference, his demands, his occasional conviction that the monastery's resources would be better deployed in ways the monastery does not agree with. A monastery under direct papal protection is, in practical terms, independent of everything except Rome, which is too far away to interfere with the daily schedule. The freedom this gave Cluny allowed the abbots, a series of extraordinary men, stretching from Odo to Peter the Venerable across 2 centuries, to develop the Cluniac program without interruption. By 1100, Cluny controls roughly 10,000 monks distributed across 1,500 daughter houses spread across Europe. The abbots of Cluny are, in practice, the most effective reformers of the Western Church, operating from a Burgundian hillside through a network that requires no army and no taxation to function. The Cluniac monk's day begins in the darkness before midnight. The bell rings for matins, and the monks rise from their beds in the dormitory and walk in the dark, in silence, to the great church. The church at night is illuminated by candles, more candles than you would find in any other building in medieval France, because the liturgy requires the musicians to read their books, and the books require light. The smell of beeswax is the smell of Cluny's wealth as much as its devotion, because beeswax candles cost what tallow candles do not, and the difference signals something about the level of investment being made in the Opus Dei, the work of God, which is the Cluniac monk's primary occupation. After matins and lauds, the monks return to their beds for a few hours before prime, which calls them at first light. Then the day offices follow one upon another: terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. punctuating the day so thoroughly that the intervals between them barely allow for the reading, the copying, and the careful correspondence that the monastery also requires. The barely sleeping monk, moving through a building of extraordinary beauty, is both the product and the instrument of Cluny's programme. At Citeaux, 30 kilometres south and east, they have deliberately chosen the opposite. Founded in 1098 by a monk named Robert of Molesme, who found Cluny's luxury intolerable, the early Cistercians settled in a waste marshland and began draining it. Their habits are white, not black, the undyed natural wool of a flock that has not been dyed to the Cluniac black. Their churches have no gold. Their chant is stripped back to plainsong, the elaborate melodic embellishment of Cluny's liturgy removed until what is left is functional and austere. The buildings are clean stone, well proportioned, illuminated only by clear glass. The rule is silence, and the rule is manual labour, and the rule is that the monk's body is as much an instrument of prayer as his voice. A monk who visited Cluny after spending a year at Citeaux would feel the way a person feels coming from a very simple, very clean room into an over-furnished parlour, overwhelmed, a little confused, not sure whether the richness is an argument for the richness or against it. The Cistercian church has no stained glass, clear glass only, so that the light enters plain and falls plain on plain stone walls. This is not economy, but theology. Coloured glass at Cluny is an argument that beauty is an act of worship, that the eye's delight is close to the soul's uplift. Clear glass at Citeaux is the counter-argument, that beauty of this kind distracts the mind from the interior work of prayer, that the monk should look inward and not be seduced by what is passing and decorative. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote a long and magnificent denunciation of the decoration he found in Cluniac churches. The carved monsters and hybrid creatures in the capitals, the painted figures in the arcades, all of it a distraction from proper devotion, all of it money that could have gone to the poor. The denunciation is itself a work of great literary art. The irony may have been available to Bernard, and he may have chosen to ignore it. Bernard of Clairvaux joined Citeaux in 1112, and he brought with him roughly 30 friends and relatives he had personally recruited to the monastic life. His recruitment ability was extraordinary enough that people later said parents were afraid to let him speak to their sons. His letter-writing ability was extraordinary too. He wrote to popes, to kings, to abbots across Europe, and they read what he wrote and frequently did what he suggested. By the time he died in 1153, the Cistercians had expanded from a single marsh-draining community in Burgundy to somewhere around 350 houses across Europe. The expansion is partly Bernard's personal force and partly the appeal of the Cistercian programme to a generation that found Cluniac luxury spiritually suspect and wanted something that felt more honest. The Cistercians are, incidentally, agricultural engineers of the first order. Their preference for remote, waterlogged sites that no one else wanted, meant they arrived with drainage problems and solved them, season after season, generation after generation. They rerouted rivers. They built fish ponds and mill races. They established the Grange farm system, large outlying farms, run by lay brothers called converse, who took a simpler vow and did the heavy manual work that the choir monks could not do without abandoning their hours of prayer. The conversi drain the bogs. They clear the forest. They plant the vines. The grange farm that belongs to the Abbey of Citeaux sits on a piece of ground the monks received as a gift from a Burgundian nobleman who wanted his soul prayed for in perpetuity. It is a practical transaction, land in exchange for prayer, and both sides understand the terms clearly. The conversi who work the grange rise earlier than the choir monks and retire later, because the animals do not observe the canonical hours. A converso who manages the fish pond learns, by decades of observation, which sections of the pond produce the best fish at which time of year, and which feeding arrangements keep the stock healthy through the winter, and when to drain the pond and when to leave it. This knowledge is not written down for a long time. It accumulates in the body of the person who does the work and transfers to the next person by demonstration rather than text. It is, in its way, as careful and as sophisticated as anything being thought about in the left bank disputation rooms of Paris, and it is happening in a field in Burgundy. The vines are the most consequential agricultural work the Cistercians do in Burgundy. The walled vineyard at Clos-Vougeot, the great enclosure on the Côte de Nuits, its stone walls still standing today, still enclosing vines, is a Cistercian creation built over the 12th century by the monks of Citeaux on land they received as gifts from donors who understood the value of being remembered at the altar. The conversi who tend the vines learn by observation what centuries of Cistercian record-keeping will gradually articulate. That the different sections of this hillside, separated by a few hundred metres, produce wine that is unmistakably different. That the upper section, closer to the forest edge, produces something structured and austere. That the lower section produces something rounder and more immediate. That the difference is in the soil, the slope, the drainage, the exact microclimate of a particular pocket of the hillside that cannot be replicated elsewhere and cannot be explained by any theory they have available. They note it. They continue. The concept of terroir is being invented in practice without a name for it. In September, when the harvest comes, the conversi pick the grapes with the same attentiveness they bring to everything. The grapes go into collecting baskets, and the baskets go to the press house, and the press house smells in September of crushed grape and must, and the first faint edge of fermentation that tells you the wine is becoming what it will be. The pressed juice goes into barrels, and the barrels go into the cool cellar beneath the grange, and the monks pray over them. Not because prayer changes the chemistry of fermentation, but because everything that happens in the monastery happens under the sign of prayer, and the wine is not less important than the prayer, but neither is it more. It will be drunk at the monastery's own table, and it will be sent to bishops and abbots and kings who have earned the abbey's gratitude, and both uses of it are entirely consistent with the Cistercian understanding of what a monastery is for. The conversi themselves are in a curious position. They live at the grange, not in the monastery. A deliberate separation, because the choir monk's enclosure requires quiet, and the conversi's daily work is loud with animals and tools and the physical noise of farming. They pray fewer hours. They eat less well. They do the heavy work. They are the necessary fiction that allows the Cistercian program to function. The monks maintain both poverty and productivity because the productivity is technically done by someone else who has taken a different vow. It is not a comfortable position to occupy, and by the 13th century there will be documented rebellions of converse against their choir monk superiors. Men who discover that the promise of spiritual reward in exchange for physical labour looks different from the labour end of the transaction than from the prayer end. The bell that calls the choir monks to Compline drifts across the valley, softer than the Cluny bell, because this building is smaller and the bell less grand. In the vineyard below, a lay brother straightens from the vine stock he has been examining, checking the leaf colour, the state of the developing grapes, reading the vine the way a physician reads a pulse, and looks up toward the bell without moving yet. His back aches. His hands are stained with must from the morning's work. The evening light is gold on the limestone of the abbey wall. He picks up his tool and walks back toward the Grange buildings, not toward the choir. The monks are going in to sing. He is going in to eat, and then to sleep the sleep of a man who has spent the day working in the open air, which is, by any measure, a good sleep. The century between 1200 and 1300 is the closest medieval France comes to prosperity, and you can feel it in the texture of an ordinary day without knowing the dates or the economic theory behind them. The roads are safer than they have been in living memory. The harvests are mostly adequate. The church calendar governs the week, the season, and the year with a steady rhythm that gives even the hardest life a shape. On the horizon, visible from most of the higher ground in the wine country of Burgundy and Champagne, or from the northern fields of the Ile-de-France, there is almost always a cathedral under construction, the stone too pale for the surrounding landscape, too vertical to be natural, the scaffold and the spire still in progress and perhaps still 2 generations from completion. It is a different kind of horizon than the smoke of a Viking raid or the banner of a chevauché. You are a farmer in the Champagne plain or the Burgundy wine country, and your life is organized around the strip fields and the vine rows in a way that has been true for every generation you can remember, and seems likely to be true for every generation to come. The open field system runs on communal agreement. The village assembly sets the ploughing dates, the sowing dates, the date on which the fields are thrown open for common grazing after the harvest. The geese, everyone's geese, the village's common geese, have a regulation, a day on which they may be let onto the stubble and a day on which they may not, and the regulation is argued about at the assembly with the same seriousness as the ploughing dates, because the geese matter, and the rules that govern the commons are the difference between a community that holds together and one that does not. The village assembly meets in the churchyard, or in the nave of the church when the weather is bad, because the church is the only interior large enough to hold everyone. The priest presides at the edge of the proceedings and tries to keep the tone from deteriorating entirely, which is not always possible when the question of who let their pigs onto the unfenced fallow 3 weeks before the agreed date comes up again. The man accused of the pig infringement has a well-rehearsed explanation. His explanation is not accepted this year any more than it was last year. The fine is levied. Everyone goes home. The assembly has done its work. The village continues to function as a community, which is what the assembly is for, the fine being almost secondary to the demonstration that there is a body capable of levying it. In the wine-growing village, the year has a different shape from the grain village. February, pruning, the cold work of cutting back the previous year's growth, your breath making clouds in the morning air, your hands going numb on the pruning hook. The vine at this stage is a grey tangle, apparently dead, with no indication that it intends to produce anything in the coming year. You cut it back harder than seems reasonable, guided by a knowledge that is bodily rather than verbal. Your hands remember how much to take from 2 decades of pruning the same row. May, tying the new shoots to the training stakes, the most delicate work of the vine year, done carefully because a broken shoot is a loss that compounds for years. June brings the flowering, and the whole vineyard smells for 2 weeks of something between honey and chalk, a smell so specific to this moment that it does not recur anywhere else in the year. September, the vendange, the harvest, and the whole village in the vines at once, because the window for picking is narrow and the grape waits for no one. The Lord's overseer is there, counting the harvest as it goes into the collecting baskets, calculating the champart, the Lord's share, before the grapes reach the press. The champart is not a fixed proportion in the way the tithe is a fixed tenth of produce. It varies by the Lord's discretion and the negotiating position of the village, which means it varies by how much leverage the village has, which means it is rarely generous. Wine is dues and drink and trade goods simultaneously, and every village in the wine country understands this triple quality and cannot separate the three. The harvest supper after the vendange is the one evening of the year when the Lord's hall opens to the pickers. Long tables in the yard, if the weather holds, or in the great barn if it does not. The wine that is served is last year's wine, the new must still bubbling in the barrels and not ready to drink, but last year's wine is good this year, and everyone knows it because they made it. Bread and salt, pork and a sauce of onions and herbs. The noise of 40 people eating together after a week of hard work in the open air. The satisfaction of a completed thing. You sleep that night with the smell of crushed grapes still in your hair and your shoulders aching in a way that is honest and complete. The ache of work that has been finished rather than the ache of work that has been abandoned. The women's market in the French village is a space that operates somewhat differently from the space around it. Women sell eggs, cheese, bread, cloth, herbs, the products of the kitchen garden and the dairy. In some regions of France, in some areas of the north, and in parts of the south where customary law has developed differently from Roman law, married women hold property rights that allow them to make these transactions on their own account, not merely as their husband's agents. The specific extent and legal standing of these rights varies enormously by place and by century and by exactly which version of local custom the nearest court happens to follow. The market stall is not a statement of gender equality, but it is an economic space where women move with a kind of autonomous competence, setting prices, extending and collecting small credits, building the long relationships of mutual obligation that keep a village economy running. The woman who brings the best cheese to market every Tuesday knows something about the market that no charter ever fully captures. The kitchen garden behind the cottage produces the vegetables that the strip fields do not. Leeks and onions through most of the year. Their smell strong in the cooking pot and stronger in the breath of anyone who eats them, which is everyone in the village. Garlic along the south-facing wall. Cabbages and turnips for winter, stored in the root cellar under a layer of straw. Herbs in the border nearest the door. sage and rue and fennel, the plants that Charlemagne's estate instructions specified for every garden, still being grown in the same places 400 years later because the instructions happened to match what people had always grown anyway. The garden does not produce glamour. It produces continuity, week by week, through the lean season and the plenty season alike. The tail, the Lord's tax, is the particular French burden that has no direct English equivalent. In England, by this period, custom governs the Lord's extractions with some degree of predictability. A villein owes this kind of week work and these dues at these seasons, and while the custom can be abused, it has a shape. In France, the taille à merci is the Lord's right to levy at will. Not a fixed amount, not a customary amount, but whatever the Lord decides. The Lords have, in practice, been somewhat constrained by the realities of peasant capacity. You cannot extract more than a tenant can pay without destroying the tenant's capacity to pay next year. But the principle of arbitrary extraction is built into the structure, and the anxiety that accompanies every harvest is not only the anxiety of weather and disease, but the anxiety of not knowing what portion of what you grow will be taken from you before you can eat it. That uncertainty is the taille à merci, and it is a French peasant's specific burden, and it grinds in a way that is hard to describe from the outside. The tithe to the church comes on top of the taille to the Lord, and occasionally the king's tallage arrives on top of the tithe. And in a year when all three land simultaneously, you count what is left and do arithmetic with the answer that you do not want to perform. The tithe barn at the monastery or the parish church fills in autumn with grain you grew on land you work and will not eat this winter. There is a theology of this that the priest explains on certain Sundays. The grain returning to God who provided the rain that grew it, the community supported by the community's offering. The theology is not wrong, exactly. But it coexists with the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is also not wrong, and the two live together in the same person without resolving. St. Louis sits under an oak tree at Vincennes and hears petitions. This is the image that Joinville, his biographer and companion, gives us of Louis IX's style of justice, the king accessible in the open air, listening to whoever comes, dispensing judgment personally. Whether it happened as regularly as Joinville suggests, or whether Joinville is giving us the ideal rather than the practice, or some combination, scholars have debated this. What is clear is that Louis IX was genuinely regarded as a just king by the people who lived under him, which is not the usual verdict on medieval kingship, and that the legend of the oak tree justice was powerful enough to survive him. For the French peasant in 1300, St. Louis is the king who was supposed to listen, which is already something more than most kings offer. He also builds the Quinze Vingts in Paris, a hospital for 300 blind men in the year 1260, and the Saint Chapel, that extraordinary reliquary of stone and glass, and he dies on crusade in Tunis, which is the death of a man who took his faith more seriously than his survival, and even the people who suffered most under the tale could recognize, in that, something they understood. The texture of this century before the catastrophe is something you should be allowed to rest in for a moment. The church calendar, Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, the feast of the patron saint, Martinmas, the thin bright days of November when the old year's grain is in and the new year's obligations are being counted. Each feast day a rest from work, a gathering at the church door, a brief communal softening of the daily grind. The The Sunday Mass with its incense and its Latin, and the priest's voice moving through prayers most of you have memorized through repetition without ever understanding them in the way a scholar would understand them, but carrying them in your body in a way that is more reliable than understanding. The smell of tallow candles and the cold that comes off the stone floor even in June. The particular quality of light in a small Gothic village church in the early morning. A single narrow window above the altar, the coloured glass throwing a patch of rose and gold onto the opposite wall. The rest of the interior in a dimness that is not dark but something softer. The village not yet knowing what is coming. The vine rows neat. The field strips laid out from boundary hedge to boundary hedge in the long parallel lines of 1,000 years of work. The smoke rising from the cottages in the late autumn afternoon, the smell of the baking bread from the Lord's oven drifting across the yard, the bell from the church tower sounding the hour with the patience of something that has been sounding the same hours for 100 years and plans to continue. Rest there for a moment. Just for a moment. Marseille, late autumn, 1347. The ships came in from Kaffa on the Black Sea coast with their cargo of cloth and spice and the thing that no one knew they were carrying. The signs were already present on some of the sailors. The swellings in the armpit and the groin, the blackening under the skin, the fever that ran so high the sick seemed to burn from within. The harbour masters of Marseille, the accounts say, ordered the ships away. Some of the ships left. Some of the sailors had already come ashore. The rats had already come ashore. The damage was already done, in a way that no harbour master's order could have addressed, because the mechanism was not yet understood. By the spring of 1348, the disease was moving north along the trade routes of France, following the roads the merchants followed, pausing at the towns where goods were traded and people gathered, and where one person's cough could reach 100 others in an afternoon. It moved as trade moved, up the Rhône Valley first, then across the Burgundian Plateau, then into the Loire Basin, then the great grain plains of the Isle de France. Paris by the middle of 1348. The northern provinces and Brittany by 1349. The remote uplands by 1351. There was no escaping the direction of it, only the timing. The road from Marseille to Paris was the same road the cloth merchants and spice merchants had ridden for generations. It passed through Montpellier and Lyon and the great monasteries of Burgundy, through the market towns where the Champagne fairs had once drawn merchants from Venice and Flanders, through the villages where the tail and the tithe were collected every autumn with the mechanical precision of a system that had been working for 300 years. The disease used all of those connections. Every road that moved grain and wine and silk also moved the rats and the fleas that rode in the bales and sacks and the bedding of the carters who slept in the inns along the way. The infrastructure of medieval France's prosperity was also the infrastructure of its undoing. Givry is a village in Burgundy, south of Beaune, in the wine country. It is notable now to historians of the plague because its parish death register survives. In a normal year, the priest of Givry records between 20 and 30 deaths. Births, marriages, deaths, the parish register is the record of a community's vital events, kept in the same hand year after year, the entries spaced evenly, because in a normal year, people die at the pace that people die. Old age, winter, fever, childbirth, the accidents of farm work. The priest knows every name he writes. He has baptized most of them. He has given the last rites to their parents. In a village of 1,200 people, the priest is the keeper of the community's memory as much as its spiritual life. In August of 1348, the entries begin to come faster. Then, much faster. Then the pages fill in a way they have never filled before. In the months of August, September, October, November of 1348, the register at Givry records approximately 615 deaths. In a village of perhaps 12 or 1,300 people, that is roughly half the population in one season. The priest's handwriting, which begins the year in its regular, careful form, becomes less steady as the summer turns to autumn. You can see it in the register. Not a dramatic deterioration, not a sudden change, but the gradual loosening of a hand that is writing too fast, writing under pressure, writing through grief. Then a different hand takes over. The first priest is among the entries. Think about what that means for the village in practical, daily terms. The harvest is due in September. The vendange, the grape harvest, which in Burgundy is the year's most important work, falls in the same weeks when the dyeing is at its worst. The vines do not stop ripening because people are sick and dying. The grapes that are not picked will rot on the vine, and the wine that is not made cannot pay the tale, cannot settle the tithe, cannot be traded at the autumn market. So the people who are still alive and still able to stand go into the vines anyway. They pick alongside the fear. They carry the harvesting baskets with the same hands that have spent the morning at a graveside. The wine gets made because the wine must be made, and it goes into the barrels in the stone cellar under the house, and it is there through the winter, fermenting quietly in the dark while the village above it tries to understand what has happened to it. Paris had perhaps 100,000 people in 1348, one of the largest cities in northern Europe, and the plague moved through it with the efficiency of something that had no reason to spare anyone. The Hotel Dieu, the great hospital on the Ile de la Cité, built to receive the sick of every kind, was overwhelmed within weeks. Bodies piled in the courtyard. The sisters who nursed the sick sickened and died in such numbers that the hospital's function essentially collapsed. King Philip VI fled the city because kings could flee and most people could not. The craftsmen in their guild workshops could not flee. The carters and bakers and market women and university students crowded into the left bank's cramped streets could not flee. The poor who lived in the oldest parts of the city, where the buildings leaned together above the narrow alleys and the air was dense with the smell of the river, could not flee. The masters of the Sorbonne met to debate the cause. Their conclusion, that a particular configuration of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had poisoned the air, was wrong in its astronomy and wrong in its pathology, but it was the most sophisticated explanation available to the most learned men in France. The wrong answer was the best answer anyone had, and people kept dying regardless. At Avignon, where the Pope had been resident since 1309, Clement VI burned large fires around himself in his chambers on the advice of his physicians, because fire was thought to purify the air of the miasmatic corruption that the prevailing theory said caused the disease. The fires may have helped in the indirect way that keeping warm in a cold season helps the body resist illness. They did not help the city around the Pope. Avignon was among the worst-hit cities in France, crowded, set in the Rhône Valley, a crossroads of trade and pilgrimage that was also, by this logic, a crossroads of transmission. The papal court, the cardinals, the bureaucracy of the Western Church, all within reach of the same rats and fleas that reached the tanners and the dyers in the city below the walls. Clement issued a bull protecting Jews from the pogroms that broke out across southern France and Germany as people searched for someone to blame for what was happening. The accusations of well poisoning, the panicked logic of a world trying to find human agency behind something that had no human agent. The bull had limited effect. The pogroms continued. The dying continued. In the village of Givry, and in thousands of villages like it across France, the flagellants moved through in the months of the plague. Bands of men in white robes with red crosses, processing through the market squares, striking themselves with leather straps and iron-tipped cords in a public act of penance, calling on God to turn away the pestilence in exchange for their suffering. The spectacle drew crowds. It also drew criticism. Pope Clement condemned the movement in 1349, judging that it had grown beyond the Church's control and that its theology, the idea that private suffering could substitute for priestly sacrament, was dangerous. But the flagellants were not primarily a theological movement. They were a fear movement, a response to a death rate that no one's faith had equipped them to absorb, an attempt to do something, anything, when the ordinary responses had failed. The priest of Givry is dead. The hospital is overwhelmed. The king has fled. The doctors have nothing useful to say. Walking through the town and beating yourself is at least something you can do with your hands. Whole villages emptied. Livestock wandered through settlements with no one left to tend them. Fields went unharvested because there were not enough hands to cut the grain. A monk writing from Normandy in 1360 described the countryside as a landscape of abandonment, wolves moving through places that had been towns, the particular silence of an uninhabited building that still holds the shape of the life that was lived in it. The monastery near Marseille, where the prior and most of the monks died within days, left a record of a community extinguished so fast that there was no one to give last rites to the last survivors. The rites that were supposed to ease the passage between this world and the next were the first casualties of an epidemic that moved faster than ceremony. France had perhaps 17 to 20 million people before the plague arrived. By the time the first great wave passed, the best estimates suggest 6 to 8 million of them were dead. This is not a number that the mind can hold as a number. It becomes comprehensible only at the scale of a single village, a single register, a single priest's handwriting growing less steady through the weeks of a Burgundy autumn. The France that existed in 1290, the world of the vendange and the tale and the slow peace of the wine-growing village, is gone. Not entirely gone. The strip fields are still there. The wine press is still there. The church bell still sounds the hours. But the people who worked the fields and operated the wine press and rang the bell are fewer by roughly a third across the country and by half in the worst-hit places. The aftermath was strange in a way that only becomes visible across time. Labour had become scarce. The manse you worked is empty. The lord who owned the neighbouring manse has no tenants. Wages, where they existed, in the towns, in the trades, rose because there were fewer people to do the work and the work still needed doing. The old social order was not immediately overturned, but it was visibly cracking in a way that would be felt across the next generation in the peasant revolts, the renegotiated labour obligations, the slow shift of power that comes when the people at the bottom of the system discover that they are less replaceable than the system had assumed. The tail merci, the lord's right to tax his serfs at will, met a new reality. The serf could walk away because there was a vacant manse in the next village and another lord who needed tenants badly enough to offer better terms. This did not end serfdom, but it bent it. Picture Givry in the December of 1348. The register is in the hands of a new priest, a younger man, writing carefully in a hand that is steadier than the last entries of his predecessor. The dying has slowed. The village is half empty, or something close to it. The wine harvest happened because the people who were alive in September went out and picked because the grapes do not wait, even in a plague year. The wine is in the barrels. The register has several empty pages between the November entry and the December entry. The December entry is sparse. The priest closes the register for the night and the candle burns low, and the village outside is quiet in a way it has never quite been before. Quieter than winter quiet, quieter than the particular quiet of a cold, clear night when the frost holds the air still. It is the quiet of a place that is missing a portion of itself and does not yet know what it will become without that portion. The fields will be worked again. The vines will be pruned again in February, just as they always have been. Life will continue, as it does, in the forms available to it. But it will be a different life, carried by fewer people, through a landscape that has more empty houses in it than anyone alive has ever seen. The smoke is the first thing you learn to read. Not the smoke of your own hearth, which is familiar and domestic and carries the smell of the evening meal, but the wrong smoke. The smoke of grain, of thatch, of the particular acrid quality of a mill burning that comes from several miles away and tells you, before any messenger arrives, that something has gone wrong in that direction. The year is somewhere in the 1360s, and you have learnt to read the wrong smoke the way your grandfather learnt to read the river smoke of the Viking raids, which is to say, you have learned it because not knowing what it means is more dangerous than knowing. Your grandfather, in the year of grace 1300, lived in something close to the long peace of the high medieval village. He paid his tail, he tended his strips, he went to church on Sundays and to the autumn market with his wine or his grain, and the roads between his village and the next town were safe enough that his wife could walk them with a basket of eggs and return in the afternoon. That world lasted for 2 generations after him. Then the plague came, and then the war came, and they came close enough together that the people who lived through both were shaped by a combination of loss and fear that is difficult to describe simply, because it was not one thing but several overlapping things happening at the same time, none of them ever entirely finished. The 100 Years' War is not what it sounds like when it is described in the Chronicles, which is to say, it is not a coherent war with clear sides and identifiable fronts. From where you stand, in a village in Normandy or the Île-de-France or the Champagne Plain, the war is something that arrives and departs and arrives again, and in between its arrivals there are things that are almost worse, the routiers. Unemployed soldiers, discharged from whatever army last paid them, which is to say routinely during truces, since a truce means the pay stops but the soldiers remain, who move through the countryside extorting whatever they can from whoever they encounter. The pates is the word for what they extract, a protection payment made to a particular company or captain in exchange for a promise not to burn your village. The promise is sometimes kept. Sometimes it is not. The difference depends on the captain's character and mood, and whether a better offer has come from somewhere else, and you have no way to evaluate any of those variables. You pay the pates because not paying is worse, and you hide what grain you can before they arrive, and you hope. The routiers are not an abstraction in French archival records. They are a documented daily reality. Regional tax surveys and ecclesiastical complaints from the 1360s and 1370s name specific captains, specific villages, specific amounts extorted. The company that holds the valley north of you is called something you will not repeat in polite company, and its captain is a Gascon who served the English at Poitiers and discovered that the truce of 1356 meant he was no longer being paid. He is not ideologically English or ideologically French. He is a man with armed followers and no income, and the countryside around him is full of villages that cannot defend themselves. He has been in this valley for 3 years. You have paid him 3 times. You have also paid the French captain who arrived last autumn and made a rival claim. You have paid both, and you are tired in a way that goes deeper than the tiredness of a difficult harvest. The chevauchée is the formal military version of the same terror. The English strategy of mounted raiding, burning crops, mills, churches, the infrastructure of royal revenue, worked not because it destroyed armies, but because it made the French crown look impotent, unable to protect its own countryside. A chevauchée moving through your part of France in a summer meant the harvest, if it was not yet cut, was gone. The mill was gone. The bridge was probably gone. The priest might be gone. The Lord's manor house might be gone. You were alive if you moved the animals early and hid the grain in the underground pits that every village kept for exactly this purpose, and if the chevauchée was fast enough that the riders did not stop to search the farm systematically. Sometimes it was fast enough. Sometimes it was not. The hiding pits, shallow chambers dug beneath the barn floor or covered with loose stones at the edge of the wood, are found by archaeologists in villages across Normandy and Picardy and the Champagne Plain, and they date to exactly these years, because these are the years when a village needed somewhere to put the things that mattered most before the wrong smoke appeared on the horizon. After a chevauchée, A village had to rebuild without assistance and without insurance and without any guarantee that what it rebuilt would not be burned again before the harvest. The mill, which the Lord theoretically owed a duty to maintain, often stayed broken for years because the Lord had also lost men and revenue and was extracting from his surviving tenants whatever he could to cover his own losses. The tale of Mersai was at its worst in war years because the Lord's needs were at their worst in war years, and the Lord's obligation to restrain his demands had no enforcement mechanism that a villager could rely on. You owed what he said you owed, and what he said you owed went up when the English were near. The Jacquerie erupted in 1358, north of Paris, among peasants who had been pushed to the edge by every pressure this chapter describes simultaneously: the plague aftermath, the English invasion taxation, forced labour on the Lord's castle walls after Poitiers, and the contempt of a nobility that responded to military defeat by extracting more from the people who had not been defeated and could not afford to be taxed. The uprising was brutal and brief. The peasants killed lords and burned castles for a few weeks before the nobility crushed it with equal brutality, and it changed nothing structurally. But the violence of it, and the speed with which it spread, alarmed the governing class in a way that no previous peasant grievance had, because it demonstrated that the people at the bottom of the feudal system had a capacity for organized anger that everyone had been counting on them not to exercise. The Jacquerie is not a mystery if you know the years that preceded it. It is a village that has paid the paiters and the tail and lost the mill and buried a third of its people to the plague, and one morning a man who has had enough picks up a tool and uses it as a weapon, and the man in the next village does the same, and for a few weeks the lords discover what it feels like to be frightened by the people they have always frightened. The journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris was written by an anonymous Parisian, probably a church official of some kind, a man of middling education and genuine curiosity, across the years 1405 to 1449. It is one of the great primary documents of urban French life in the worst years of the war. He records food prices, which rise and fall with the military situation. He records executions, which are public spectacles in the square outside his window. He records the weather, the quality of each year's wine harvest, the appearance of comets, the coming and going of armies outside the city gates. He is a man keeping his own kind of account of a world that seems to be coming apart, and the act of writing it down is its own form of order in a time when order is scarce. In the winter of 1421, he records that wolves came into Paris at night and ate people near the cemetery of the Innocents. This is the city at its lowest point, the English in the north, the Burgundians in control of the city itself, the food supply disrupted, the bridges controlled, and wolves in the streets because the walls can no longer be maintained, and the wolves are doing what wolves do when the human presence thins. He keeps writing. He does not romanticize what he is seeing. He is frightened and specific and honest about being both. The cemetery of the Innocents, where the wolves are eating people, is the same cemetery where generations of Parisian dead have been buried, where the charnel houses lean against the perimeter wall, where the dance macabre frescoes, painted in these very years, show death leading the Pope and the king and the merchant and the ploughman in the same dance, equally, because plague and war have made equality, immortality into something that everyone already knows without needing to be told. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, the war within the war, ran from 1407 to 1435, when the Treaty of Arras finally ended it. The Duke of Burgundy and the Armagnac faction fought over the French crown while the English exploited the division. Paris changed hands between them. For the ordinary Parisian that the journal describes, the Civil War means shifting curfews, food shortages, fear of both sides, and the particular exhaustion of not knowing which authority to obey. The Burgundians are in the city this month. The Armagnacs held it last year. The English are at the gates and may be inside by spring. You pay whatever tax is being collected by whoever is collecting it, and you go about your business as carefully as possible, and you write it all down, if you are the kind of man who writes things down. He is. He does. In Lorraine, in the village of Domremy, sometime around the year 1412, a girl is born to a family named Dark. The village has perhaps 20 stone houses, a church, a spring, a beech tree on the common called the fairy tree, where the village girls hang flowers and sing in the spring. Her father holds roughly 50 acres and serves as the village's tax collector, which is a position of middling local importance. Joan, she will be called Joan, spins wool. She sews. She helps with the animals and the harvest. She attends church carefully and prays with a devotion that her neighbours later describe as distinctive. She does not learn to read. Domremy has never been occupied, but the war is a distant rumble that sometimes comes closer. A raid from the Burgundian faction, a burned farm on the far side of the river, the sound of alarm from the next village. The anxiety is a permanent background texture of the village's life, the way the plague anxiety was a background texture for the previous generation. Joan grows up inside it the way you grow up inside the weather. It shapes you without your necessarily choosing to be shaped. At her trial in Rouen in 1431, asked about her childhood skills, Joan answered in a way that has stopped every reader since. "I fear no woman in Rouen at sewing and spinning." The warrior, tried for heresy, asked to defend herself, reaches for her needlework. It is either a canny move, establishing normality, domesticity, the ordinary girlhood the prosecution is trying to deny, or it is simply true, which is that this was part of who she was, the girl from Domremy who sewed and spun and heard voices, and neither of those things cancelled the other. The wrong smoke on the horizon that shaped her childhood is the same wrong smoke that shaped every village in this chapter. She simply did something with it that no one had anticipated. Orleans, April of 1429. The English have held the city under siege for 7 months. The French relief efforts have failed twice. The city's food supply is running low, and the morale of its defenders is the particular kind of tired morale that comes from months of waiting to lose. Then, on the 29th of April, a relief army arrives with a 17-year-old girl from Lorraine riding at its head in borrowed armour, carrying a banner embroidered with the lily and the names of Jesus and Mary, and everything changes within 9 days. Think about what the village of Domremy would have looked like when Joan left it. She would have walked the same lane she had walked since childhood, past the fairy tree on the common, past the church where she had prayed, and the spring where she had drawn water. She had heard voices in that churchyard. St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret, she said at her trial, speaking in light and in bells, since she was about 13 years old. She had kept the voices to herself for years, the way a practical person keeps an unusual inner life private when the world around them is already strange enough. She told her father that she intended to go to the Dauphin and relieve the siege of Orleans, and her father, who was a sensible man, was not pleased. She went anyway, at 17, because the voices had become urgent enough that staying felt worse than the obvious difficulty of persuading a failing king to give an army to a girl from Lorraine who could not read. The liberation of Orleans is militarily significant, but it is psychologically decisive in a way that military significance alone could not be. The English have not been stopped like this in a generation. Their longbow advantage at Crécy and Agincourt was supposed to be permanent. A girl from Domremy is not in the calculations of English military strategy. The disruption is not tactical. It is something stranger and harder to counter. It spreads through France the way news spreads in a world without printing. Imperfectly, through second and third hands, the details not quite reliable, but the shape of the thing clear enough. The English can be pushed back. The French cause is not lost. Someone said so, and someone believed her, and they turned out to be right. In a country that had been losing for 90 years, the arrival of that news in a village was like a window being opened in a room that had been shut too long. Rheims, July of 1429. The coronation of Charles Viate in the great cathedral, the ancient oil of Clovis poured on the new king's head, Joan standing behind him with her banner. French medieval kingship drew its deepest legitimacy from this specific ritual in this specific city. A king crowned at Rheims was consecrated in a way that no military victory could match and no legal document could substitute. The oil of Clovis. The story held that an angel had brought a vial of holy oil to the baptism of the first Frankish Christian king, and that the same oil, miraculously replenished, had anointed every legitimate French king since. Whether or not you believed the story, and most people did, the ritual was what made a king in the understanding of everyone who lived under him. Charles had been the Dauphin, the uncrowned heir, a figure whose claim to his own throne had been questioned by the Burgundian faction and by the English propaganda that called his mother into question. After Rheims, he is the king, in the way that mattered most to the people who understood these things. Joan's role in making that happen is the role of a symbol as much as a soldier, and she knew it. You can hear her knowing it in the trial transcripts, in the way she speaks about the banner she carried at Rheims as more important than any weapon. Joan was captured by the Burgundians at Compiègne in May 1430 and sold to the English, who tried her at Rouen in a church court under the presidency of the Bishop of Beauvais. The charges were heresy and wearing men's clothing. The trial records survive nearly complete, and they give us Joan in her own words, or as close to her own words as a court transcript in Latin can give anyone, and the words stay with you. She is precise. She is brave. She is occasionally dry. She is 19 years old and she knows she is going to be burned, and she answers the questions anyway, sometimes with the patience of someone explaining the obvious, and sometimes with the sudden sharpness of someone who has noticed an inconsistency in the prosecution's logic. She is not frightened into silence. She is not cowed by the row of learned bishops across the table from her. She maintains, through weeks of questioning, that her voices were real, that her mission was legitimate, that what she did at Orleans and Rheims was done at God's instruction and not at the devil's, and that the men in the room who are calling it heresy are wrong. She is burned at Rouen on the 30th of May 1431. The man who lights the fire asks that the flames be banked lower so that her body is visible throughout, to prevent any claim that she escaped. The ash and the bones are thrown into the Seine. The English want no relics. She is 22 years old. The war continues for another 22 years. The momentum has shifted, but momentum shifts slowly in a conflict of this scale, and the institutional reforms take time. Charles Viat, the King Joan made legitimate, reorganises the French army. The Compadnies d'Ordonnance, established in 1445, are something new in Western Europe, a standing professional army under permanent royal pay, not the feudal levy of knights who owed seasonal service and went home when the campaign season ended. This is a different kind of army from anything France has had. It is paid regularly, commanded by professional captains who serve the king rather than their own lords, and it is available year-round rather than for the 60 days of feudal obligation that the old system provided. The routiers who have been extorting the countryside for a century are absorbed into this structure or driven out, because the king now has the means to enforce order in a way his predecessors did not. For the village that has been paying the pates for 3 generations, this is not an abstract political change. It is the first spring in living memory when the wrong captain does not arrive with armed men and a demand. Normandy falls to French forces by 1450. Gascony, the last major English holding, falls by 1453. The 100 Years' War ends not with a treaty, but with the simple fact of the English running out of French territory to hold. There is no signing ceremony, no formal instrument of peace. The English simply stop being present, and the French countryside they occupied becomes French again by default. In a village in Normandy in the year 1452, the English overlords are packing. The practical reality of this for the village is modest and important in equal measure. The English bailiff will no longer appear to collect the English taxes. The English garrison in the nearby market town will leave, taking its particular combination of requisitioning and commercial disruption with it. The French customs that the English administration had partially displaced will return. The market will reopen under French jurisdiction. None of this will happen quickly. The village is poorer than it was in 1300. The population is lower, the fields are not all back in cultivation, there are abandoned homesteads at the edge of the settlement that have not been reoccupied because there are not enough people to occupy them. But the smoke on the horizon is, for the first time in living memory, the wrong kind of smoke, which is to say it is not there. Louis XI came to the throne in 1461 wearing a battered felt hat with lead pilgrims' badges stuck to it. The kind of hat a pilgrim to a minor shrine might wear, not the kind a king of France was expected to wear. And riding, apparently, a donkey. He was the universal spider, the chroniclers called him, though they called him this mostly in fear rather than contempt. A man who preferred lawyers and merchants and spies to dukes and knights. He kept a cage in his castle for enemies he wanted close at hand but not free. He consolidated the kingdom not through battle, but through the patient accumulation of advantages, buying what he could not inherit, and inheriting what he could not buy, and occasionally arranging for the deaths of people who were inconveniently in his way. He is not the kind of king whose story appeals to the part of the imagination that wants banners and single combat. He is the kind of king who reads letters carefully, who notices discrepancies in accounts, who sends a spy to a place before he sends an army. The chroniclers who called him the spider meant it as an insult. It was also an accurate description of why he succeeded where his more conventionally magnificent predecessors had failed. In 1477, Charles the Bold of Burgundy died at the Battle of Nancy without a male heir, and Louis moved into Burgundy with the speed of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment for years. The great independent duchy that had been the centre of Cluniac monasticism and Cistercian wine and the Champagne fairs, the Burgundy that had sheltered the English during the worst years of the Civil War, that had sold Joan of Arc to the English, that had been in some respects a separate country within the borders of France, was absorbed into the kingdom. France began to look something like its modern map. Not the map of 1950 or even 1600, but recognisably the France of a single crown, a single administration, a single king's justice reaching from the Norman coast to the Burgundian wine country, from the Loire Valley to the Mediterranean shore. The printing press came to Paris in 1470 at the Sorbonne. The first books printed in France were produced by scholars who had learned the technology in Germany and brought it to the university that understood its implications most quickly. A book that had taken a Cistercian copyist months of work now cost a few sous and could be produced in hundreds of identical copies. The literate bourgeoisie, the lawyers, the merchants, the university graduates who had been multiplying since the 12th century, expanded again. Not immediately. Not everywhere. But the direction was clear, and the direction was toward a world in which the preservation and distribution of knowledge was no longer dependent on the work of monks in cold scriptoria and the patronage of lords who could afford to commission manuscripts. Something was ending. Something was beginning. The two things were happening at the same time, as they usually do. The village in 1480 knows nothing of this yet. The priest reads from a manuscript, the same way priests have always read. But in Paris, in the workshops near the Sorbonne, the pages are coming off the press at a pace that the manuscript world cannot match, and the world is changing in a way that will eventually reach even the most remote village, the way every change eventually does, slowly, and then all at once. The light is going down behind the ridge to the west, that particular shade of amber that belongs to the late afternoon of the French countryside at the turn of October, when the vintage is in and the fields are resting and the year is shifting toward the shorter days without drama. You are standing in a village in the Champagne Plain, or the Burgundy wine country, or the Ile-de-France in the year 1490. The particular village does not matter as much as the shape of it, which is the shape that every village in this chapter has had, more or less, for the past 1,000 years. The strip fields running out from the settlement to the boundary hedges, the church at the upper end, the mill by the stream, the smoke rising from the row of household hearths, the Lord's house somewhere in the middle distance. Your great-great-grandmother was born in this village in 1300, and she worked the same strips you are working now. She would recognize the field boundaries. She would recognize the shape of the church, though it has been rebuilt in places. The old Romanesque arch replaced with a Gothic one, a small pointed window where there used to be a round one, the local saint's image repainted in the cleaner colours that became fashionable in the last century. She would recognize the bell, because it is the same bell, cast in the same foundry her grandmother's generation commissioned it from, and it sounds the same hours it has always sounded: prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, the canonical hours that organize the day from before dawn to after dark. She would not recognize everything. She would not recognize the printed sermon the priest reads from on Sundays, the small book with its even, machine-formed letters that carries a text reproduced in 500 identical copies across France. She would not recognize the easier terms that the Lord now accepts, the slight loosening of the tail that has happened since the plague made labour scarce and the routiers made civility feel optional. She would not recognize the feeling of a kingdom that, for the first time in her great-granddaughters' lives, is not being fought over by competing armies on her own fields. Stand in the strip field for a moment and feel what the field actually is, in the body and in the hands. The soil of the Champagne plain is chalky and pale, lighter than you expect, crumbling between your fingers into something almost dry even in October. The plough team has been through twice already this week, turning the fallow strip for the winter wheat, and the earth is opened and fragrant in the way that turned soil has always been fragrant. It is a smell that connects this year to the year before it and to the year before that, back through Carolingian surveys and Frankish timber halls and Gallo-Roman villa estates to the first people who broke this ground and found it workable. The strip is yours in the sense that you work it and pay dues on it, and your children will work it after you. It is not yours in the sense of a modern deed. But the boundary stones at its ends have been in the same positions since before your grandfather's grandfather, and the village assembly has not moved them in anyone's memory, and there is a kind of tenure in that stability that is deeper than law. The road at the edge of the village is safer than it has been in a century. Not safe in the way a modern road is safe. There are still bandits, still accidents, still the ordinary dangers of a world with no bridges over the smaller rivers and no roadside assistance when the axle breaks. But safer in the sense that a traveller moving between the market town and the next village over is not routinely stopped and robbed or threatened with the burning of his house if he does not pay a protection fee. The King's justice reaches further than it did in Louis XI's father's time, and Louis XI's consolidation of the great principalities has removed the patchwork of competing local jurisdictions that made the countryside ungovernable for 3 generations. The market town to the east opens on Thursdays, and the journey to it takes 2 hours on a road that is not good but is passable. You can carry eggs and soft cheese and a small quantity of last year's wine in an earthenware jug, and someone will buy all of it before the afternoon bell. You will return with iron nails and a measure of salt and perhaps a strip of blue cloth for your daughter's festival dress. The road home will be safe enough that you do not think about it until you are already home. That is new. That is worth noticing. The priest is reading from a printed book this Sunday, and some of the congregation can follow the words in their own copies, held carefully because a book is still a significant possession even when it is no longer an impossible one. The priest himself has thoughts about this that he does not entirely share with the congregation. The printed text is stable in a way that the copied text was not, identical from copy to copy, immune to the small variations that a tired copyist introduced over centuries of retranscription. It is a more trustworthy record than anything the scriptorium produced. It is also cheaper, faster, and available to people who could never have afforded a manuscript. He is not sure whether the stability is more important than the availability or the other way around. He reads the printed sermon. The congregation listens with the variable attention that congregations have always brought to the Sunday sermon, which is to say that some of them are paying close attention and some of them are thinking about the wine in the barrel and whether the drainage ditch needs clearing before the first frost. The village churchyard is the place where everyone this village has ever produced now lies. Your great-great-grandmother, who worked the same strips, who paid the same tale, who walked to the same market. And the people who died in the plague summer of 1348, whose names are in the Givry Register or in the register of 100 villages like it, recorded in a handwriting that grew less steady as the weeks passed. And the young men who went with the levy to fight the English and did not come back, and the old men who survived the routiers and the chevauchés and the jacquerie, and the women who spun wool and raised children in the years when the wrong smoke was on the horizon and the Pater's captain was expected before harvest. All of them in the ground under the same bell that sounds the same hours it has always sounded. You know their names because the priest knows their names, and the priest knows them from the register, and the register has been kept in this church since before the plague. The chateaux of the Loire will begin their transformation in the next generation from military fortresses that happen to have comfortable rooms into something lighter, more horizontal, more open to the garden and the river view. Ambours, Blois, Chenonceau. The Gothic of the cathedral will soften into a French form of the Italian Renaissance, still recognizably French in its proportions. The steep roof, the dormers, the tall chimneys that are a French response to the northern climate that Italian architecture alone cannot solve, but changed in ways that no amount of deliberate tradition can fully resist. The medieval period in France does not end with a dramatic event. It softens at the edges. The strip field is still there. The church bell is still there. The wine barrel in the stone cellar is still there. But the world around these things has shifted, and the shift is accelerating. The autumn harvest is finished and the grain is in. The barrels of new wine are sitting in the cellar below the house, sealed with their wooden bungs, beginning the slow fermentation that will settle them by winter into something drinkable and clean. In Burgundy, the Cistercian monks of Clos-Vougeot are doing the same thing with the wine from their walled vineyard, as they have done every autumn since the 12th century, pressing the same Pinot grapes on the same stone floor, reading the fermentation by smell and colour, and the small sounds the barrel makes in the silence of the vaulted cellar. The monks who laid the walled vineyard's foundations are 6 centuries dead. The vineyard is still producing. The wine is still made in October. The wall still stands. Some things last longer than the world that made them. Stand in the field at the end of this long day. The vine rows are pruned for the coming winter, the stakes neatly reset, the work of the vendange finished, and the wine in the barrels. The grain is in. The animals are in. The fire in the cottage hearth is the warmest place in the world, and you settle beside it the way every generation has settled beside it, back through the carved Carolingian manse, through the sunken Frankish hut, through the tile-floored villa where the last Gallo-Roman tenant watched the road traffic thin. The fire does not care about dynasties. It requires only the same things it has always required: a log, some air, and someone to tend it through the night. The 1,000 years are in the ground under your feet. The mosaic fish, the iron axe named in a will, the polyptych measured to the nearest perch, the bells that pulled monks to prayer and warned villages of danger and marked the hours of markets and the beginnings of harvests. All of it still there. The plague, the war, the chevauchée, the jacquerie, the wolves in the Paris streets, the priest's handwriting going less steady as the weeks of August pass. All of it also there, under the feet, in the soil that has absorbed every season for 12 centuries and will absorb 12 more. The village is quieter now than it was in 1348, quieter than it was in the worst years of the war. Not emptied. Healing. The children of the survivors of the plague are the grandparents of the children playing in this village's churchyard now. The light is almost gone. Somewhere to the west, past the ridge, the sky still holds a thin line of amber. The church bell sounds the evening hour. The smoke from the hearths rises straight in the still air. A dog settles near the fire with the easy confidence of an animal that has been warm and fed today and expects to be warm and fed tomorrow. Outside, the road is quiet. The strip fields are at rest. The night is coming on gently, the way the medieval period is ending gently, without drama, the new world arriving the way good things arrive, gradually, and then all at once, and then just there, as if it had always been there. The fire is warm. You are home. Now, with the night, the long journey through this country's centuries settles around you. The Seine plain, the Burgundy oak woods, the chalk ridges of Champagne, the cathedral towers still visible in the last light. All of it growing distant now. You carried 1,000 years tonight, from Bodo's measured manse to the printed sermon in the village church. You sat with the weight of the plague register, the sound of the wrong smoke on the wind, the spinning that Joan of Arc was not ashamed of. You heard the bells of Cluny and the silence of the Cistercian Grange and the noise of the Champagne Fair. All of it is settling now, the way the embers settle after a long fire, dropping from brightness into something quieter and deeper. The France that carried all of this, that held the mosaic floor and the Viking river and the cathedral scaffold and the vine rose and the plague, was not a country for most of its medieval life. It was a landscape of particular people, particular fields, particular bells sounding particular hours. That is what it remains in the end. Not the kings and the dates. The fish in the mosaic. The iron axe on the peg by the door. The handwriting going less steady as the weeks of August pass. These are the things that history cannot abstract away, because they happen to real hands in a real place, and the ground still holds them. Your body is heavy now. The thoughts that were following the story begin to dissolve at the edges. The medieval world, with all its smoke and stone and particular cold, becomes distant, the way a country does when you have crossed back over its border and the landscape has changed and the air is different. What remains is only the warmth. The fire. The darkness that is not threatening but simply the right condition for sleep. You are warm enough, safe enough, tired enough. The hearth crackles softly to itself. The night outside is the same night that settled over 10,000 French villages in the year 1250, in the year 1348, in the year 1490. The same stars, the same darkness, the same long patience of a world that continues. Let the story close around you like a blanket, like the walls of a good room, like the darkness itself, which is just another kind of shelter. The bells have sounded the last hour. The fire will keep through the night. Sleep now, as they once did, wrapped in the quiet resilience of people who endured and continued, and whose names the fields still hold. Sweet dreams.